Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Bill Hamlet from the Naval Institute. Welcome to this morning's engagement theater panel. The topic this morning is value and speed of commercial solutions to meet future naval challenges. I have the pleasure of introducing the moderator of the panel, Mr. Mike Brown. He's the director of the Defense Innovation Unit at the Department of Defense. He led the initiative for a new DoD-sponsored investment vehicle, the National Security Innovation Capital, to fund dual-use hardware technology companies. Previously, Mike served as a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow at OSD, and he's the author of a Pentagon study on China's participation in the U.S. venture ecosystem, a catalyst for the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. Mike was the CEO of Symantec Corporation, chairman and CEO of Quantum Corporation, and chairman of EqualLogic. He received his BA in economics from Harvard University and his MBA from Stanford. And at some point, he'll figure out what he wants to do when he grows up, and
you never figure that out.
So please join me in welcoming Mike Brown and the panel up here. And I think this will be a great conversation. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Bill. Well, thanks very much. Being responsible for the Defense Innovation Unit, which is all about accelerating adoption of commercial technology. You could probably guess that I have a strong point of view on this topic, which is how can we use commercial technology to advance what we're doing in the military. So in fact, Ash Carter set up the Defense Innovation Unit almost 7 years ago now. And it's great to see that we're starting to see some payoff from some of that in terms of some larger production contracts going to commercial companies that are supporting the military, like Anduril, that I'll talk about in a minute here. Commercial tech really can solve a lot of the military's problems. What I've heard from visiting with a lot of folks in the Pentagon over the past few years is the tendency to think that our military problems are very unique. They are unique, but commercial technology can do a lot to solve those problems. Just some quick examples. We're working on a project that uses digital wearables, a watch and ring like the one I'm wearing, that can assess readiness and tell us whether our sailors are going to be sick 48 hours before they even feel any symptoms. So this could be a huge boost to readiness. Not just a military problem. Obviously, we can use that in a world, especially the one we're in now, where we're in a pandemic, trying to assess whether folks are illness and contagious. Another good example would be situational awareness. Think about what's going on, how the world is able to see Russia amassing the military on the Ukraine's borders. Well, we don't have to rely just on exquisite government assets to do that. We actually can look at commercial satellite imagery, and that's what you're seeing if you're tuning into evening news or looking at something online and seeing the pictures of the Russians mobilizing. We're really seeing satellite imagery from commercial companies that have thousands of satellites now in low Earth orbit. So another commercial technology that the military is just figuring out how to use. And another good example, sensor fusion. A lot of the efforts of something like JADC2, which are all about taking advantage of a tremendous number of sensors out there, really is a problem that the commercial world is also facing. How do we see what's happening with all those sensors and put it into a common operating picture? So while what we might do in the military with some of those technologies might be a bit unique, the commercial world isn't figuring out how to blow things up, but the underlying functionality is something that the commercial world is solving. And I think everyone here from the military would recognize that we need to be modernizing the military at a faster rate than we are, and we got to do that on a fixed budget. So we don't never get as much money to spend as we'd like to. And while that's a very tough problem, modernizing without getting the resources you like, commercial technology can be one of those areas that actually helps us here, because in that way we can tremendously benefit the taxpayer by stretching those dollars further. It's always going to be less expensive to use commercial technology than it is going to be doing something custom with one of our defense contractors. So with that as kind of the backdrop, I'm excited today to have two very experienced folks to help me talk about this topic. What value can we get from commercial technology? And I'll start with introducing Matthew Steckman to my left. He is the Chief Revenue Officer for Anduril, which is a very interesting company that I'm going to ask him to talk about in a moment. The Chief Revenue Officer is kind of where the rubber meets the road. That's the probably the most measurable set of objectives you have in a company because you're responsible for delivering revenue or sales in the company. Prior to being at Anduril, Matt was the CRO, Chief Revenue Officer at Zipline, another DIU company that we worked with. And that is the first small drone company that was delivering blood and other medical supplies. Very, very innovative company. I want to congratulate Matt and the Anduril team because not only did they win a production contract with DIU, about a $99 million ceiling for some of the counter-UAS technology, but now they've expanded that. In the commercial world, they call that landing and expanding to do a big contract with SOCOM that has a $1 billion contract ceiling. This is more what we need to see to show the investment world that it definitely pays off to work with the U.S. military. So very excited to have Matt here with me today. And then to my left, Commander John Hassey, someone that we've worked with quite a bit at DIU. He's the Principal Assistant Program Manager of PMS 408. I'll ask him next to talk about what PMS 408 does. Unmanned and small combatants as part of NAVC. PMS 408 has a lot of experience with commercial technology. They're about to start their 5th project with DIU and has made several transitions meaning moved into production with the budget behind it so we can scale capability and get that into warfighters' hands. So thanks to both Matt and John for joining me here for the discussion. Matt, let's start with you. Why don't you give everyone kind of a thumbnail of what Anduril's business is all about and the unique idea behind starting Anduril?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. And no pressure or anything with the intro, man. No, but thank you. It was very kind words. So we started Anduril about 5 years ago. We're actually about 1,000 people now, so it's been a pretty interesting 5 years, as you can well imagine. The idea was to bring the best of the U.S. technology sector sort of back into the defense community. Disciplines like autonomous systems, edge computation, artificial intelligence, technologies that are really resident in communities that generally the defense industrial base and the Department of Defense don't have access to. And so the kernel of the idea was, how do you start a company structured more like a modern software company, a Google, a Netflix, these types of big sort of titan companies now. So structure the company like a software company, but recruit and put folks to work against national security challenges. And so we started it again 5 years ago on kind of an idea that this might be something interesting to try. A lot of us had defense backgrounds, technologist backgrounds, and off we went. As a company, we specialize in bringing autonomous compute to hardware systems. So we generally take a software-first approach to solving really every problem that we tackle. And today we find ourselves doing everything from autonomous force protection, autonomous aerial systems, including closed-loop autonomy, as well as participating in a lot of JADC2 exercises that I'd bet we will get a lot of questions on today. So that's a little bit about Anduril, and really happy to be here. Yeah.
Let's do one follow-up because it's such an interesting story, the founding of Anduril. Tell a little bit about the founder, Palmer Luckey, and how he got to start Anduril.
Sure. So so for those of you who don't know the name Palmer Luckey, he invented the Oculus VR headset, basically from an Airstream trailer in his parents' backyard. Grew it to a pretty sizable base and sold it to Facebook for about $2 billion just a handful of years ago. There's a lot of interesting parts of the story. I think the interesting thing for this conversation is Palmer today will still tell audiences, the world, whomever, that he actually didn't invent anything. All of the basic technology was robust and developed at the time needed to create pretty inexpensive virtual reality headsets. And he claims that he's actually just a complex integrator of things and not actually an inventor of things. I think it's a really interesting perspective it's a perspective that we hold at Anduril. We focus a lot on integrating very, very high TRL component technologies together, but in new and unique ways. And so when I talk about tech, that's generally the lens that we're viewing it from, really because of how Palmer thinks about the world.
That's great. John, tell us about PMS 408 and kind of the scope of things that you look at there.
So as a program office, probably most of the folks in the audience are a bit familiar with that, but we would manage cost, schedule, and performance. Matthew talked about how they take a software approach to their capabilities. Ours are primarily hardware-based, so if you look at the DoD budget and the way our programs are structured, you start with a hardware platform. So we start and look at the hardware platforms that are both unmanned underwater vehicles as well as remotely operated vehicles. We also look at some of the systems that sailors would actually use in the water. So we're primarily focused on those things that support the explosive ordnance disposal community's mission in order to ensure access to the oceans and waterways for the entire Navy as well as for commercial shipping. And so we wind up starting with this hardware first approach, but the interesting thing for us is we've realized that even a hardware platform is only going to be as useful as its best software, or moving forward, autonomy, AI, and ML. And so what we've needed to do is to figure out how to take these hardware platforms and make them really a software-first approach with incremental development and rapid transition to things that are on par with what the market is doing, so that we can keep pace with the threat and the way things are developing. And so what we wind up doing is we have these hardware programs. We have to manage the complex integration of these systems across a number of government as well as commercial agencies. And one of the things we always ask is, how can we leverage partners like DIU? How can we partner with agencies like DIU in order to get access to technology and capabilities to integrate into our platforms, where for less cost and at greater speed we can field a better capability? And so that's one of the things constantly on our mind, and probably one of the reasons we're up here is we're looking at that same space and asking those same questions, right? How can the best of tech enable defense, but from the defense side? So things unique to us are the budget, continuing resolutions, legal contracts, the FAR, right? Sort of the traditional obstacles that many people see. We've also found there's nested capability inside of that system. And we've been able to find with critical partnerships, again, like with DIU, how we might maneuver in that space more effectively. And so what we've been able to do is to field to sailors some of this capability we're talking about, as well as manage the complex integration that a number of different commercial and as well as government agencies do to create and to maintain those platforms.
Thanks, John. When we started this panel, we talked about the fact that the military needs to modernize faster. And we have some very specific plans. Certainly the CNO has laid out his 2021 NAV plan. And of course we have from General Berger the Force Design 2030. What do the Marines need to have to think about the next conflict rather than fighting the last one? So these gives us some very broad directions in terms of how to modernize. Tell us how you think about when you see those. How does PMS 408 think about really aiming what you're doing to support those broader plans?
Right, so I think that that's a very large topic. I'll just probably narrow down to the capability development and acquisition part, and I'll just share my experiences, and hopefully that they're useful to others. I think there's probably 4 important things we've learned. I think those are that you need to have key partnerships in place in order to first do deliberate and incremental capability development. That's the only way to implement some of these technologies. I think the second thing is that you have to have a rapid transition of COTS capability, or else by the time it's delivered, it's irrelevant. But the third thing is that you need to take a view about how you can transition these to production. It's not just enough to transition the product, but how do you scale that production and sustain and manage that over time? So third is the transition of production. And then I think the fourth and maybe the most important part is how do we scale this once it's fielded and updated at will? Because one of the really complex problems is maneuvering these updates into the cyber and other regulatory requirements we have. And so in terms of doing each one of those 4 components effectively, we found that the most important thing to have right is the partnerships. And I think you mentioned a moment ago, we're back for our 5th partnership. We found DIU to be the most effective in terms of like cultural and process alignment to enable those 4 critical parts. And I'll just share a quick example of where it's been really effective.
Great.
We had a remotely operated vehicle program. So think about an underwater robotic system tethered to a person on a boat who's operating it with controls. And what the deliberate and incremental part of it was that first we came and found platforms, and we brought these platforms in with DIU as just a commercial product, basically. And then what we did is we said we want to move the intelligence that we know the best of technology and the best of artificial intelligence and machine learning providers and approaches, let's move that onto the vehicle. We didn't necessarily have that expertise. Matthew, sort of as you mentioned, like we don't bring those into the DoD very well. And so DIU was a partnership where we could then very quickly get a lot of proposals, narrow them down to the best technical approaches, because your technical depth and bench was so good that we could quickly put contracts in place to look at prototypes for this remotely operated vehicle. And in the time it would have normally taken us to review written packages, we were looking at working prototypes. And then what we could do is the next step in that process could be based on actual data, experience, and demonstrated capability in a relatively uncertain domain for us, as opposed to reviewing hundreds of pages of written proposals. And so those 4 things were really wrapped up in that project, and I think demonstrate the success of how we can modernize the fleet with key and critical partnerships where we find our team's not strong, yours was very strong. And I think that partnership allowed us now to get artificial intelligence and machine learning onto a 3 remotely operated vehicles in less time than it would have taken us to review the packages without your assistance.
Well, that's a great example. I think this really underscores some things that we're thinking about at DIU. We call the fast follower strategy, which means if we're not inventing the technology at DoD, like we've done with many technologies in the past, semiconductors in the late 60s and early 70s, where now we're a small part of the worldwide consumption, many of the technologies that we need for modernizing, like autonomous systems, AI, machine learning, cyber, et cetera, we're not inventing those at DoD. We need to access what the commercial market is doing. So John just illustrated a couple of key aspects about being a fast follower. One, you don't have to start with requirements. You don't have to tell the commercial market what to build. Typically, they've already built something. And then he emphasized speed. In the same amount of time that you might spend writing requirements, we could already be evaluating prototypes, not reviewing hundreds of pages that someone developed for a government proposal, but let's start working with the hardware. And then another key aspect, I think, is getting end users or warfighters involved. So that experimentation helps companies design better, so we know that that application works in a military environment. And then something very near and dear to our hearts, production contracts. We have to be focused not on the experimenting part, but about scaling the capability. So PMS 408 provides a great example of that. If we're not focused on that from the beginning and planning that transition, then we ask vendors like Anduril to hurry up and wait. Please go through our process to experiment and then wait for a POM cycle. That's no way to modernize. So thanks for that great example. Matt, nothing probably could be more important in modernizing than autonomous systems and AI. So many applications. I wonder if you could just tell us how you think about how that can change what we do in the military if we start applying what commercial companies like yours can do in those areas.
Sure, it's another big question. So, I guess I'll start by saying that, from a force design policy, how these things are actually going to get employed, the vast majority of people at this conference are probably more qualified than I am to answer that question. So I'll stick to the view of the technology sector and the engineering sector. So when we look at these things, there's an expression in engineering circles called first principle thinking. So really what that is engineers get around and say, unconstrained, how would I solve these problems? And what are the things that actually matter, the tenets of that solution that will drive this to be successful? And so when we look at the challenges that the department is going to be facing over the next decade and probably forever, we see basically 2 things that autonomy, you really can't picture solving without autonomy. So the first thing is efficiency. So how do I do the missions that exist today more efficiently with less manpower, with less expense, and continue to maintain the capabilities that we have today? And that's sort of like side one of the coin. The second piece of this is how do I advance capability? So the shift to near peer fight, It's not just being able to do things more efficiently, but it's actually being able to get significant gain out of the technologies that we are deploying. And again, you really can't picture a world where autonomy is not a foundational technology to both efficiency and capability development. And so for us, it's not an if. It's a matter of will and speed and concentration on the part of the department and on the part of the defense community to employ these technologies properly. I have come to believe, and this was validated in our recent experience with Task Force 59 in Bahrain. I'm not sure if folks are following those events that occurred over the last few weeks and the exercises and amazing experimentation that occurred out there. I've come to believe that autonomy and the interconnected nature of really robots on the battlefield, we should just call it what it is, it's not actually a hard technology problem. Actually, most of the things we need for the next decade are solved fundamentally. You know, I mentioned Palmer in his Airstream. Right? He didn't invent anything. So the technology problems are solved. I am increasingly of the mind that the problem is going to be the speed and concentration of adoption. And a good example here is, you know, the Task Force 59 budget was, let's be honest, it was budget dust. We need to start thinking about the employment and development of autonomy like we think about a nuclear submarine, like we think about an aircraft carrier, like we think about a joint strike fighter. Those are the amounts of dollars and the concentration of effort that will be needed in order to actually employ these things successfully on the battlefield. We're not seeing that right now. It's very frustrating from a technologist perspective to go to exercise after exercise after exercise and just wipe the floor with everybody's expectations. And then afterwards be told, to your point, Mike, wait a couple years. We'll get around to doing this. That's not the way that we need to be approaching these problems, and it's something that I'm hoping that these types of conversations, organizations like DIU can help solve.
Thanks. I think it'd be interesting to hear you talk about some of the applications that you're tackling today. Some of what you're doing with Customs Border Patrol, what you're doing with us in terms of counter-UAS. Can you give us more of a feel for what those applications are and what you're able to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So we think about technology in terms of adjacencies. So when you create anything new, any new system, you try and find the first easy problem to solve in order to get everybody adjusted to the new reality. And then you start to tackle adjacencies. And as I mentioned, our company is 5 years old, and the number of adjacencies we've been able to tackle in that time is, at least from my perspective, kind of staggering. So we started with the most basic application of autonomy and AI, which is I've got a line in the sand, or I have a circle in a military base, and I need to know everything that's coming across that line or that circle. And I don't want people to do it. I don't want people to have to look at screens. I don't want people's brains to be the sensor fusion engine. I just want to alert someone on their phone when something bad or something has to be decided or responded to. And that is the easiest first problem to solve with these new types of techniques and challenges, and so that's what we did. And we're currently deployed across 500 miles of the U.S. southern border and protecting a couple of dozen military bases, all services now around the world. The natural adjacency to that problem is things in the air. And so we thought about how do we take these technologies that are looking at the ground, point them up, and see drones that are doing very, very bad things sometimes above our bases and above our deployed operations. It turns out that it's a much harder problem, but with DIU and with partnership with some other organizations, we were able to take basically the idea, which started literally on a whiteboard. Me and a couple of folks actually at the Defense Digital Service in the Pentagon, if you've ever been there. It's actually the only good Wi-Fi in the Pentagon. It's a hot tip for everybody.
True.
It started on a whiteboard, like how do we convert this technology to do counter-drone operations? And then with the support of DIU through a couple of commercial service offerings, some CSOs, some combat validations with some forward-leaning units, and then ultimately some pretty forward thinking by PMCP down at SOCOM headquarters. We went from that whiteboard to a $1 billion program of record in 31 months. which seemed very slow at the time to us in the startup community, but for government, that's light speed. I could talk for hours. The next adjacencies, if you start to think about this and you think about sort of the logical conclusion of this is, how do I use the software we had to develop to detect things and disrupt things in the air, but control things that we don't build? And that's your JADC2 problem. So how do we create the fundamental computing engine that can connect all of the current things that we have and all of the future things that we have with these fundamental technology components? And so we find ourselves in the middle of a lot of JADC2 conversations, and sort of the secret is because we had to build it all of ourselves in order to control our own robots. And by doing that, we hope that we're bringing unique perspective to the way that we're thinking about this.
Thanks. One of the things that we're concerned about at Defense Innovation Unit is making sure that there's a broader and ever-growing set of companies that want to support the military. So Matt, you're kind of in a unique position. You've been at 2 companies now, Zipline and now Anduril, that have had that question in front of them from a business model standpoint. Not the easiest thing to do to say, I'm going to go after the military. Tell us a little about the thinking, the factors that are involved in whether to pursue the military as a market for the company.
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate reality is it's actually a terrible idea. You cannot start a new business right now and reach any kind of scale working with the Department of Defense, period. And we should all let that sink in for a little bit. You have to have an insane constellation of variables in your favor in order to even approach the types of things that at least we at Anduril are approaching. Zipline was a little different because we had 99% of the business was commercial, and the defense was just a nice revenue stream. That's a little bit different. If you're going to tackle the problem head on and start a defense company that reaches venture scale, which is a bit different than sort of your traditional defense approaches, building businesses, growing slowly over decades, 10% a year. Venture scale is get to 1,000 people in 5 years, grow at 100% every year, and as things are burning around you, just hold on for dear life as the company is growing. That's what we're talking about here. You need a founding team that's done it before. You need a team that's able to raise an absolutely insane amount of money. You need very, very patient investors. You need expertise from within the community that is extremely expensive for startups to go out and buy in terms of human capital. You need a deep, deep knowledge of congressional affairs and how money moves through the system. All of these things are needed to even have a chance at approaching venture scale within the defense market. So it really is a bad idea. And we hope that in some of the things that we're doing and in talking publicly about our experiences, even making policy recommendations when we have the chance to do it, that we can make that path easier and more accessible to a community of companies that I know are out there that want to engage with the department, but unfortunately can't right now.
So if you had a magic wand, I think you're right. I think a lot of companies struggle with whether or not to support defense, even though they might like the idea. They might have investors looking at them askance that this is really going to take a lot to tackle, and do you really have experience or what it takes to do that? If you had a magic wand so that it would be easier, what are the top 3 things you would change?
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure Congress is listening as you talk.
Yeah, it's actually it's not that hard. Well, it is hard because there's a lot of 50 years of doctrine that make it hard, but it's not that hard. So it's actually have open competition. I would love someone to do a study to figure out how many open competitions are wired for a winner ahead of time before that solicitation ever hits the light of day. It's got to be 85%, right? Probably north of that. Some of you are shaking your head in the audience right now. There is no fair competition. That's one. I would change that. I would make those competitions force the fielding of technology and the actual demonstration of something real in the world, which forces companies to invest in IRAD. God forbid we actually spend our own money on solving the Defense Department's problems, so that people are bringing not full solutions to the table, but something that's 70 or 80% of the way there. And then afterwards, I would pour a tremendous amount of money into the winner. I wouldn't sort of skirt around and do innovation theater and write $1 million checks here or there. I would say you won, and therefore here's several $100 million to keep this moving. And yes, you're going to get the answer wrong 1 in 4. But those 3 other decisions you made just changed the department in a way that you couldn't have otherwise done. So it's not hard. I think there are internal champions within the department that sort of understand those 3 approaches and run their world in those ways. We seek those people out, and we sort of all glom onto them as a technology community when we see a person who thinks the way we think. But yeah, if given a wand, those are my 3 choices.
It's interesting when I hear you talk about the things you would change for someone who spent their career in the commercial world before coming to government service, only the last 6 years of my career. It's really a commercial way of doing business. So if I hear what you talked about, open competition, let's see what the best of U.S. capitalistic system can provide to us, and then moving quickly to get to fielding capability. It's not about reviewing documents, and then, as you said, invest in the winner, which means as soon as you see someone that can provide the capability you're looking for, give them the contract, let them start scaling up. That's very much a commercial way of doing business. Very much tried and true. It's not something that is rocket science. We just need a way to adopt those methodologies in the Defense Department. John, let me turn to you. One of the things that I think you probably want to do as a program office is figure out, are you scanning effectively commercial technology? How do I have access to what's out there? Tell us a little about how you think about how do I get access, how do I see what's out there so I could figure out what to start applying?
Yeah, let me start by saying that I am very proud to be apparently in the top 15% in the DoD by running fair competitions. So if nothing else, I got that going for me today. So Matthew, thanks for baselining my expectations and setting the bar lower than I could have imagined. We are over that. So anybody who's interested in competing for a 408 competition, we will give you a fair shake. But good to know that we're in the top 15% by doing that. When it comes to assessing, I think that we found that to adequately assess capability, the first thing that we do, because I know there's some misconceptions out there, I want to say that we do this process no matter what speed and what process we're using with full technical and process rigor. Because there's a misperception within the department that, oh, if you're rapidly, I talked in my last answer about like quickly transitioning COTS and being a partner to bring in new capabilities. And we've run into a real headwind, even on the government team, as you know, part of this government team trying to all move in this direction where people are skeptical as we're trying to assess and rapidly integrate these technologies that we might be not doing it with full due diligence. And so the first thing I'd say is that with all process and technical rigor, we begin our assessments. And when we're scanning the commercial space and for more innovative and perhaps disruptive capabilities, what we found is that the CSO process that DIU has really made part of our culture now has been the most effective to do that. And there's a number of reasons why, but that CSO process allows us, just as Matthew was saying, to look at real prototypes. And based on what we've seen, we can compare the prototype to the problem that we're trying to solve and ask the question, if we deployed 100 of these tomorrow, would they help? If we deployed 100 tomorrow, what happens if we deployed 10,000 in a year? What if we updated one piece of machine learning across this platform? What would we change in the department? And we can start asking those questions very early on by not having to believe what people tell us, but by gauging the results they were able to produce. So for us, really, the bedrock is an early assessment of demonstrated capability. I mean, one of the tenets that Matthew just laid out for if he could wave his magic wand, right? See what they can do. And we found that DIU has been the best way to move left in that process with full technical and process rigor so that we can see what these competitors can do and with fairness, judge who we want to move forward with in the next increment of development. And we can do that up to the point where we're confident that we have a winning solution. And only then, based on increments of developed capability, do we move forward with production. And I could go on about the difficulties in that production transition, but just in the assessment part, right, that is what we found to be the answer is, I mean, essentially arriving at the same conclusion with some caveats as Matthew, that like, you have to see what's available. You have to assess that and ask the questions, if applied at scale, how would we maintain and update this?
Yeah, you mentioned the CSO. We call that Commercial Solutions Opening. As its name implies, it's very much borrowed from how commercial companies do business, and that's all about maximizing competition, but minimizing the burden that companies have in competing, which means the first part of responding to a solicitation, like when John asks us, what autonomous capability is out there to go out and identify and mitigate mines, then we go out to the market and see what they have. They respond to us with a normal pitch deck they'd send to any other customer. There's no fill out this form that's government specific. So that gets us the maximum number of players because we make it easy for them to respond. The other thing that was very interesting about your answer was this tyranny of or, speed and quality.
Right.
Does going fast mean I have lower quality, I'm less rigorous? Probably not. It's possible to do both of those things. And in fact, by taking a very long time in a requirements process, I might not get the best quality because I'm not going to be able to assess the most current technology. I've already carved out a bit of time, sometimes up to a decade, in assessing what I might say as requirements, and then I don't even get the full view of what's out there that the commercial market could provide. So I think that's kind of an irony that we have this mentality that I can't get quality if I'm going fast.
And one of the caveats there is that within the profession on the acquisition side in the department, you're viewed as a professional if you can lay out in detail 10 years of planning, like at this stage we'll be here, this is how we'll classify it, this is how we'll make this decision, and you get that all approved. And what we've found is that as we're trying to exercise sort of tactical agility, people say, had you been more professional, you would have known that point 3 years ago before you started. And we're thinking, we didn't know about this until we saw the prototype in front of us today. How could we have known that decision? But we run into this conflict of culture where if you're producing a carrier, right, it might be reasonable to assume that you would know 3, 5, 7 years out every step of the process. And so that's been a real cultural headwind in some ways to trying to exercise speed with due diligence.
It's such a great point. One I see all the time in working with the military is this view, and it comes out of the Secretary McNamara era, that we can plan our way to the right answer. We can start designing the F-35 and 20 years later get the first prototype or first airframe off the line. In a tech company, I'm sure Matt could tell us, you'd be laughed out of every boardroom if you were saying that I'm going to tell you what the future is going to be 20 years from now. So maybe, Matt, you could give us kind of a contrast. How does the commercial market think about forecasting and planning and what technology is going to be appropriate rather than that linear system?
Yeah, it's a little more, it looks a little more like finger painting than I think everybody would rather admit. First, just to piggyback on the conversation, we need to get used to deploying things that are 80% done and then iterating once it hits the field. I mean, all of us have been around technology long enough where you work on something in test and in development for an eon and it hits the field and then nothing works and then you're back to the drawing board. That's not how technology is built anymore. And we struggle with this. And we do a lot of work up front with our customers to sort of attune them to the fact that this thing actually might not work when we turn it on, but it's better to turn it on early in the process, learn and iterate, than wait for years and years and years to turn it on. And I think that's a cultural shift that has to occur. And you certainly find people within government that are willing to walk that walk with you. I'm sure John's organization, among them. In terms of making technology investment decisions, I think it is a repetition in a human-based problem. So the best way to pick whether certain technology themes or movements are going to hit even a year from now is having seen those movements time after time after time and having made those decisions to invest over and over and over again and to have made those mistakes over and over and over and over again. And so in the technology business, you don't allow the decision to invest in technologies to be distributed amongst your organization. You don't have an army of contracting officers that are empowered to make these types of decisions. It really rests in a handful of people that either through intuition or learning or some other methodology have picked right, and basically they kind of have a track record of always picking right. And for whatever reason, you kind of bet on that person. It actually sort of is foundational to a lot of venture capitalist investment theses, that you're not actually picking the technology, you're picking the team and you're picking the person, because for whatever reason they kind of are always right, And that's probably the only thing that's going to allow you to forecast whether they're going to be right in the future. We can pretend to be geniuses and know how to forecast technology to the cows come home, but it's actually not true. What you see is Palmer Luckey just made me $1 billion. Probably a good chance he's going to make me $1 billion again, and therefore I'm going to give him a lot of money. And unfortunately, there's some bad impacts to that. You get kind of a copycat effect. You get a homogeneity that's actually quite unhealthy that I'm not particularly qualified to talk about, but is a problem, and I've seen it. But for us at Anduril, it's concentrate those types of decisions and the people that have made those decisions before and are generally right. Try and teach and give context to the rest of the team in terms of how those decisions are made, and continue to sort of invest in that human capital and bring those people up through the organization, and then allow them to start making decisions and mistakes on their own. So it's a weird answer to your question because it's not actually a technology answer. It's a human capital answer. But I think that's just kind of how it works.
Well, go ahead.
I'll just follow up with a comment around that because it's worth pointing out a fundamental lens that we view this differently on. And I've actually not heard this before, so I appreciate the conversation. What I think I heard Matt say is that you look at a person who's got a track record and you say, I trust that in this new domain that we haven't been in, whether it's spotting unmanned aerial systems or something else, like you were right last time in a different domain, so you'll be right this time, right? What we look at through our process is, did this company in this domain do that thing correctly in their last venture? So they'll do that thing in that domain correctly again here, and it weights that more heavily than somebody who is right in a different domain trying to enter this domain for the first time. We say, like, you've no experience in this domain, even if you founded Oculus and got bought out for $1 billion and like did it 3 other times in the interim. We're like, that's discounted in our world. And all we look at is, for this specific problem, what experience do you have solving exactly this problem in the past? And so we evaluate technology and risk so differently, it's just worth highlighting.
It's definitely worth highlighting, and probably narrows our view to the point that we're not going to be looking for the disruptive solution that might provide 80% of the value at 1/10 of the cost.
Yeah.
And we need that if we're going to monetize the military and do that on a fixed budget. I want to give you a chance to ask some questions to the panel in a minute, but before we do that, we're going to get into a topic that's a little bit wonky, and that's other transaction authority. So many of you may know that an alternative to moving fast and streamlining competition is to use other transaction authority. Now, it's not new. That was actually granted by the Congress in 1958 in response to the Sputnik launch. So not a new concept. It's just a little bit newer at the Defense Department. And why did the Congress do that? They saw the federal acquisition regulations that get more and more thick each year as we add things to that, taking a very long time, and they didn't want that to be in the way of the space race. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is from Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, who said, what we need to do with the FAR is classify that, make that top secret, and give that to the Chinese. That'll set them back 20 years. So, he's got a point in that if you've spent time looking at it. So other transaction authority is a way that Congress has delegated to the Defense Department just in the last decade to say, please go fast, do things a little differently. So I want to turn to both you guys and get your perspective on OTs and find out, how have they worked for you and what are the misperceptions about them? So John, let's start with you. What do you think are the biggest misperceptions about using OTs? I'm continually frustrated when I walk the halls of the Pentagon and see people very afraid to use that because it sounds newfangled and maybe something I don't want to take the risk in experimenting with.
Right, so I think there's actually a number of misperceptions around them. They're new, you highlighted one of them already, they're new. They're not real contracts, you can do whatever you want. They can't be protested, right? All misperceptions about, but I think the biggest, to hone in on the single one, which kind of piggybacks on the feeling that they bring to folks of discomfort, is that it's the Wild West. That with an OT you can do whatever you want and there's no oversight, and then so you can just go out and do whatever. And that makes, understandably, that makes people in our world very uncomfortable. And so you've highlighted this sense of like the hair on the back of my neck when I hear OTs going up because that's their perception, when in the reality, they are done with all the process and technical rigor of any other process, system, or agreement. and that they are subject to just as much oversight and the appropriate kinds of oversight to make sure they're not abused. And so I would say that the misperception is that it's the Wild West, and that the truth is that they are agreements that with the right discipline and technical rigor and have the right oversight are just as safe as any other sort of process.
I think that's a great point. Matt, what's your perspective on OTs? You've now received two, and this $1 billion production OT. I haven't looked at the numbers, but that may be one of the largest production contracts using the OT authority that's been granted.
Yeah. So, I just first I'll sort of give a little background. So, as the chief revenue officer, I basically sit on every negotiation our company does, and so I guess maybe this is a little heretical, but I think it's kind of all the same. There are pros and cons of every method to acquire technology from the vendor perspective, and OTs. They're great, and it's a preferred route, but in the end, it actually kind of doesn't matter. For technology companies that want to move fast, the things that matter is who's on the other side of the table from you when you're negotiating the deal. Whether it's a FAR-based contract, whether it's an OT, whether it's a CSO, whether it's whatever, sole source justification, J&As, SIBRs, you name it, we've done it at Anduril. And the single thing that changes the tenor, the speed, the effectiveness, and ultimately the success of the contract that you're then delivering against is not actually the structure that it was done through, but it was who was on the other side of the table when you were actually negotiating the deal. And so for us, we're pretty agnostic. When we get into these offices, we actually take a path of least resistance approach. We say, hey, we have some preferences. We're happy to tell you what they are if you'd like to know that. But you're the boss. You tell us what you like. And what we generally find is people kind of have just a way they're comfortable doing things. And it's better to just do that and follow the path of least resistance. And you usually end up in a better spot than trying to sort of chafe at the existing way that things are done. That's kind of a sad statement, by the way, right? You would love to be able to advocate for the right way to do things. But as a defense startup trying to do things in the world, you lack that thing that is called leverage in the commercial community. And so, yeah, maybe I've become a touch jaded on this, but it's all the same. It's really who you're looking in the eyes on the other side of the table.
Well, I think that highlights the topic of this panel, which is all about speed. So I think your point is no matter what contracting vehicle you use, speed is what's key, and getting to actual production, meaning capability in warfighters' hands than the contracting deal. I couldn't agree more with you on that. I'll just mention two things about other transaction agreements. One is the key benefit is after you've gone through the testing period, and as John talked about, we don't accept anything on faith. We actually get to see what vendors are bringing. Let's see how they do when that's given to warfighters to see how the capability performs. We don't have to recompete that once that evaluation period is done. So you can go immediately to a production contract. So that's one key advantage. The second is the kind of other transaction agreements that we put in place at DIU are non-consortium. So I think it's very confusing because other transactions, you can put a consortium together, which basically means let's get a whole group of vendors together and we'll turn to them repeatedly. I don't think that maximizes competition, which is why we don't favor that approach. So when we do a commercial solutions opening at DIU, each time we go out, anyone applies, no fees. So as I mentioned before, just send us your normal proposal that you'd send to any commercial customer, and let's start with that. I think having an alternative to the consortiums ensures that you can maximize the competition and get more people in to see what they do. Okay, well with that, let's turn and see what questions you have. We have a couple of minutes left. Questions that you have for Matt or John?
Commander Alex Campbell, Project Overmatch at Naval. My question is, how does DIU scale the mindset, the methodology of moving fast with the rigor that you guys have talked about, But I want to turn to John and ask that same sort of magic wand question. If you had a magic wand, right, how would you, and you're the service acquisition executive, what would you do to incentivize program managers, contracting officers, tech warrant holders, et cetera, to try, right, or adopt the mindset and the methodology that you've been successful with at DIU, right? Because we talked about, and I like the point that it really doesn't matter whether it's a FAR or an OT, right? From Anduril's perspective, right? It all sort of seems the same, right? But how do you get people on the other side of that table that have the mindset, right, that's aligned with some of the success that you've enjoyed in the programs at 408, right? My sense is that 51% of the DoD's acquisition workforce exists in a state of learned helplessness when you look at middle tier acquisition, or you look at OTs, right? So anyway, the long question. What would you do if you could wave your magic wand as a service acquisition executive?
Yeah, also probably not that hard. I would make so at the end of a CSO, what you get is a successful completion memo. It's a letter from DIU, and it was from our tech teams, saying that this was a success. And as Mr. Brown pointed out, that allows you to go to production at will, with one, none, as many as you would like of the competitors who successfully completed it. What I would do is pretty straightforward, is I would say that regardless of the contract and type and how that is created, the successful completion memo is legally sufficient to move to at-will production. Essentially meaning that instead of it just being a memo saying that it was successfully completed, it is the start of production. And that I could take that and I could go to perhaps one contracting shop who had the authority at any scale to immediately issue the production contract based on that successful completion memo. And the reason I would do that is because what we have found is that there is some stiff headwind to going from a successful completion memo to the award of that contract. What happens at the point you get that successful completion memo is the vendor is excited and eager and wants to continue work. The program office is eager and excited and wants to field it, and everybody stops while the system catches up. And so what I would do is that memo would be your, get out of jail free, collect $200, whatever is in Monopoly that gets you to the front of the board and just lets you go the next day into production with no further legal justification. So that's the short part of it. And the reason that is because to go to production, you need legal contracts and program management, which are separate functional areas within the defense acquisition system, to all concur. And so you've got to get everybody to a point right now with that memo where they're all comfortable saying yes. And if that memo had senior leader top cover, where it was that is sufficient for everybody, that is just the new policy, all of that headwind would be removed, and you would have the clearest path to the easiest production contract possible within the defense acquisition system. So I would make it so that any time a product successfully completed, you could go right into production without having to fight.
Interestingly enough, as often the case, not a technology problem, culture and process and just how we work. And that's what we're finding over and over and over at DIU, that there's so many technology companies, solutions, brain power out there that can help us in the military, but often we can't get out of our own way because we have a certain way of doing things that we've practiced for 50 or 60 years. So it's all about the culture and the process. So other questions that you have?
So, Mr. Brown, I think this one's mainly for you. One thing that kind of came to mind when you were speaking was I came up with this notion of the tyranny of broad requirements. So I have your webpage linked, and I look at it every day, and I see stuff like, hey, do you have a new way that you can find and destroy mines? Most small companies don't know how to destroy mines, but we might have a small technology that's part of the solution, but the way that you put them out, I can't respond. There's just no point. So what can we do to make the requirements a little bit more open so that when you got a piece of the problem that could be the linchpin, you get a fair look at it? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think when we write requirements, we tend to narrow the competition. So part of it is, we might have a technology in mind that we write the requirements for. The other is a point you raised, where we might already have in mind somebody who has an integrated solution rather than thinking about all the great component technology solutions that could work. So again, I'm going to propose the commercial solutions opening process that we use at DIU. That allows you to respond with any portion you could provide. Often, probably one of the misperceptions about DIU is that we don't work with defense primes. Not true. 10 to 15% of the contract awards we make are to defense primes. Why? Because they can integrate capabilities from a lot of innovative companies. So that allows the military to be able to mix and match and work with an integrator so that we get the best capability and we can get it quickly. So I think we need to be more open to concepts like that. I'd love to see more of the commercial solutions opening type processes expanded across the department so that we could take advantage there.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick note that that specific instance is probably on us. We're the ones who asked them to help us find mines. And what I took away from that question was, had we been more discreet about the critical components necessary, we would have given you a shot. But the way we frame the problem to DIU determines how they advertise it, and we've framed it to them really broadly. So maybe what I'm hearing is that we need to reconsider how we frame it given the technology and our willingness to have multiple things integrated. So I appreciate the question.
Well, it really speaks to how important framing a question is, right? It's like, I'm sure you've heard that example of Einstein. If he had an hour to solve some critical problem, he'd spend 55 minutes on, have I asked the right question, and the last 5 minutes on the solution. So one of the things that we try and do up front is curate the problem and make sure we're looking broadly enough when we ask the question to the commercial market so that we can, without understanding what creative solutions are going to come back, we allow for things to come in that we might not even have thought of. And I have to say, in a good number of the solicitations that we've done, probably on the order of a third to half, things come in from the commercial market that we had no idea was out there. And that's our job, is to understand what the commercial market's doing. So it just illustrates your point, so that we've got to be looking very broadly, and we got to tap into all the brain power and innovation, all of the innovation hubs and companies that are out there. Who knows what they could provide that would help us in the military?
Also, if you'd like to work with an integrator that's not a prime, please find me afterwards.
Yeah, very, very interesting model that Anduril is setting up, really to turn that on its head and be digital first and go faster and not set up the tremendous overhead structures that some of our more traditional primes have set up. So I think that's a real innovation that you guys are bringing. Maybe we have time for one more question if you have one. Well, let's sum up here. I think what you've heard is that we could be going a lot further in bringing in commercial technology, using some different methodologies to be able to support warfighter efforts. So we heard from John that here's a program office that has done that repeatedly. So we've got an example here of making that happen. I like the magic wand, though, of what you'd do if you could make that go faster. And then we've got a great example of a company here that's taking a very innovative approach to supporting defense. Fortunately, Anduril is dedicating itself to supporting defense. We're trying to work with other companies where that might only be a portion of their business, the way Zipline was when we began working with Zipline. So some great examples of here. We need to just make sure that we get out and proliferate these examples so that we can see a lot more companies that are providing innovative solutions, and seeing those very successful go on to get big production contracts like Anduril is. I'll turn to Matt and John to see if you want to sum up with any final thoughts.
I'd just say thanks for inviting me. I've learned a lot from the conversation, and it's been a joy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think really just a thank you from the technology community for what you've done at DIU.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. Join me in thanking the panelists here for a very interesting discussion.